Thank you for joining us today for the inaugural session of our series, The Global Potential for American Craft Beer, presented via partnership among the U.S. Small Business Administration, the Brewers Association, and the Virginia Small Business Development Center at George Mason University. My name is Chris Van Orden, with Dan from the SBA and Steve from the Brewers Association. I'll be one of your co-hosts for this series. So I serve as the manager of the Craft Beverage Assistance and International Business Development Programs at the Virginia SBDC. The SBDCs are a partnership between the SBA and host entities in every state. If you haven't yet made use of your local SBDC, I highly recommend that you reach out. So in addition to international trade assistance, they provide a huge range of small business support. So today's webinar is the first in a 3-session series designed to provide a strong foundation on why and how U.S. breweries can succeed in international markets. While it's impossible to be exhaustive in just 3-hour-long webinars, we do hope that you'll walk away with enough tools and resources to begin building your own export program. So now I'd like to turn things over to my co-host, Dan Pichet, National Director of Trade Finance at the SBA. Dan, the mic's yours.
Thanks, Chris. As you mentioned, my name is Dan Pichet. I'm the National Director of Trade Finance here at the U.S. Small Business Administration's Office of International Trade, and I'm really happy to be here. The craft beer industry has been something that I've been part of for the past decade. On the financing side before I came to the SBA in 2021. The industry holds a special place for me. I do a lot of writing on SBA lending, but my first actual article was on craft beer lending with SBA, and it was published in Brewbound, many years ago now. But I'll be on asking some questions, but then also hosting and leading the discussion on July 25th on financing. So if you're interested in this, I strongly suggest you check that one out, where we'll have Avery Swanson of Keeping Together on. And now I'd like to introduce Steve Parr from the Brewers Association.
Thank you, Dan and Chris. I'm going to throw some visual aids up here. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Steve Parr, and I am the Director of International Relations at the Brewers Association. For those not familiar, the BA is the national trade group for America's small and independent craft brewers. I'm not going to go through each of these, but through these platforms here, this is where we work to promote, protect American craft brewers, their beers, and the community of beer enthusiasts, including 6,000 breweries, 46,000 members of the American Home Brewers Association, and members of Allied Trade. And export promotion is one of the pieces of what the Brewers Association does. The Export Development Program that I manage operates as a partnership between the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the U.S. beer industry. We utilize grants toward international marketing initiatives to drive trade and consumer awareness of U.S. craft beer. We help breweries identify market opportunities for distribution outside of the United States, and just work to complement the industry's own efforts to grow their sales overseas. So this is a marketing program that breweries can use as a tool and a value add to their own export program. So just a couple quick examples of the type of work we do. International beer competitions serve as a useful tactic for our members. We cover entry fees as well as the cost of consolidated shipping, customs, and delivery for judging for those brewery members to compete and select competitions around the world to gain some brand awareness. And then throughout the year, we create opportunities for brewers and their beers to get into the markets through trade missions, trade shows, and festivals. The program covers the cost of international shipping, booth fees, staffing, marketing activity, and provides some travel opportunities for brewers to join us on trade missions and to meet with importers firsthand. Oftentimes, in association with any of the trade shows or festivals that we're traveling to, we'll conduct offsite activities where we invite media and trade specifically to experience guided tastings and educational seminars on American craft beer and quality best practices. And one component of that educational outreach is beer and food pairing. This has become a big part of our arsenal in promoting American craft beer in foreign markets and elevating the image of beer coming out of the United States. So here's where things stand today. In 2022, American craft breweries exported approximately 231,000 barrels of beer, valued at more than $71 million. This figure actually represents about a 15% decline from 2021. This was our first decline in years. The value did increase slightly with growing beer prices. There were a host of challenges facing exporting brewers in 2022, ranging from lingering pandemic effects on consumer sentiment and habits and purchasing, to rising inflation and energy costs, to currency devaluation relative to the strong US dollar. But the good news is that we're seeing improvement in many of these areas. And there were some notable bright spots among the EDP's targeted export markets last year. Markets like Finland, Germany, Hong Kong, and Korea, among others, all reporting notable increases. And so this slide's looking at some of our top export markets. Canada receives the majority of American craft beer exports, but certainly comes with its own complexities. Its close proximity to the United States, infrastructure for beer distribution, and consumer awareness of craft in general make it a really valuable market for US breweries. But growing local competition and a preference for locally produced beer by the state-run monopoly alcohol retailers, which we'll talk about a little bit later, has made it more difficult for new US brewers to enter the markets. Western Europe then leads the pack. The UK and Sweden, respectively, come in second and third in terms of overall export markets. And increasingly, we're seeing brewers sell their beer across mainland Europe and recently into Eastern Europe. And then looking over to Asia Pacific, this is home to some of the smaller but fastest growing markets for our members. China leads the pack in terms of volume, but South Korea and Japan are catching up. Japan specifically has one of the larger representations of American craft beer of any international market in terms of the number of breweries that are exporting there. This is largely due to a strong local brewing culture, the ability to ship, store, and distribute beer colds. And while these markets here are depicted are our top markets, you can really find US craft beer in almost any beer market in the world. And so we'll dive into some of the tactics and considerations for that later. But for now, I'll pause to pass it off to the next section, and we'll touch on those market differences and specifics later. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Steve. So really appreciate you sharing those insights. It's really helpful information, especially for those companies that haven't made any inroads into international markets quite yet, but it's informative for everybody, right? No matter what stage you're at, knowing what's happening, both at the macroeconomic level and in the kind of individual transaction level, it's really useful to know. So if you are new to exporting and you're beginning to see some of the potential in foreign markets, whether just from sort of the hearing about what's going on in general or from particular opportunities that have come your way, you might ask yourself now, how will I know when we're ready? And I'll start by giving out the unsatisfying answer. It depends. Just as there are lots of different forms that a brewery can take, from a lot of the direct-to-consumer, sell over your own bar, to massive distribution, across the country, all different kinds of forms, and we're just seeing more and more types of breweries out there now. In the same way, there's more than one way to be a strong candidate for exports. Knowing what your goals are, knowing what you're capable of, that's going to inform your strategy. So there's a multitude of options, but there are some common threads. What makes a company ready to succeed in foreign markets. So at the SBDC, with some of our state trade partners, we developed some rough industry-specific export readiness guidelines. There are some rules of thumb, across industries about when a company is ready to succeed in foreign markets and begin exploring export sales in a serious way. We developed some guidelines specific to the brewing industry, since, as you all know, the brewing industry has its own wrinkles, lots of unique considerations. And so we wanted to make sure that we could speak that language with breweries in particular. So I don't want to suggest that a company needs to meet all of these conditions to be export ready. These are guidelines for sure. That said, if you're 0 for 7 or 8, depending on how you kind of count these, you might want to think about ways that you can kind of build yourself up and start ticking off some of these boxes. The good news is a lot of these are things that you can work towards. So you don't have to worry about if, this is not an absolute thing. You're not export ready, or you are, or you're not. It's a continuum. And it's just guidelines. So don't stress out if you don't see yourself depicted here just yet. So with that in mind, one of the first things we say, because many of the regulations governing alcohol sales are set at the state level, companies that have worked in multiple states in general, know how to adapt to different regulatory regimes better than companies that have only sold into one state. Anybody who's sold across state lines knows, obviously, there are certain federal regulations that kick in. And there are also, different strategies, different kind of mechanisms for even selling. You're going to have different channels available to you. So we think that going outside of your home state for the first time can often be a good stepping stone to selling outside the US. That's not the case in a lot of industries, because there's no real difference in selling Virginia to North Carolina to Maryland. There's not really any significant differences. In beer, that is definitely a significant difference. So if you've found that you've been able to succeed in multiple states, that's a good sign. In the same vein, companies that have worked with multiple distributors tend to have additional context for the way that those relationships can exist between producer and wholesaler. I'm sure anybody who's doing any kind of distribution knows how important that relationship is. And it's really helpful to know the different forms that can take. If you're only distributing locally through a partner, you may, depending on where you're at, be accustomed to being somewhat prioritized. And you have that direct market reach where you can go out and have that high touch in that marketplace, get to know, all of your accounts. That is a possibility. However, if you're working with more than one distributor, you're going to know different ways that they're going to work. You're going to have some of that critical context to know just different strategies, how they work in different markets, how to incentivize performance with different partners. So that's helpful when you get into that foreign market, because the way that they work may be very different than in the US. This one sounds like a no-brainer, but companies should have a strong grasp of their production capacity. And I don't just mean fermentation space, right? Whatever your pinch point is, and everybody has a pinch point, right? Whatever that is going to put that cap in place. And it could be packaging, could be cold storage, could be your personnel, whatever that is, knowing where your ceiling is, having a really strong grasp of where you're going to be maxed out, and knowing that you have some room to grow. We don't want anybody starting to make international sales and getting worried, oh no, I don't want to make this sale anymore. It's not great. Of course, you want to have measured growth, but we don't want somebody rooting against additional sales. And we certainly don't want a company deciding to short their domestic buyers in order to pursue foreign sales. Margins being what they are, of course, you're going to have a lot of different considerations as like how much of your overall sales you want to go into foreign markets. We don't want people having to decide which orders to fulfill. That's not a great sign. Of course, there are limited resources, but I hope you understand what I mean by all that. Of course, brewing is a very highly regulated industry, so everyone that's here, no one's really a stranger to regulations. There are added burdens associated with exports, so that requires really strong logistics and reporting structures within the company. Your team members all need to know that you're bought in on this and that you've developed SOPs to meet all of the requirements to sell into those foreign markets, both from the US perspective and whatever it takes to be in that foreign market. You need to be able to track lots of different information with different partners and share it with the right entities, knowing which information goes where. And if this isn't your strong suit, and it's not every brewery's strong suit, like this is something that takes time to develop. That's an issue to kind of scale up and kind of skill up on before you begin selling overseas. Again, lots of regulations. You don't want anything caught up in customs, beer being a very spoilable product, and we don't want anything getting caught up in foreign customs because you didn't fill out paperwork right. I kind of alluded to it before, margins, right? There can be tough margins and added costs. In foreign markets, you're sending this product further afield. There may be some additional costs that you're incurring, but you may also have some resources to allay some of that. And we'll talk about that in time. So it's important that a brewery has a really clear sense of its profit model, as well as an understanding how to adapt that to a foreign context, right? Again, this is an area where you'd like to think that most companies fully understand how and where they're making money, but especially growing companies, may not have a really great sense of how changing one or two variables is going to impact the profitability. So foreign markets can hold a lot of appeal. There may be a lot of potential, but we want to make sure a company that's interested in exporting really understands what it's going to take to get on that path to profitability in that specific market. And it may rule out specific markets. That's okay. It's really important to make sure that you've got a really strong read on that before deciding to go in one direction over another. Companies sometimes come to us and they say, hey, I'm interested in exporting. And we ask them, well, which markets are you considering? Which direction are you considering growing? Where do you want to go? What markets do you want to go for? And they'll say any market. I just want to go overseas. That can be a bit of a red flag. They're really responding to the allure of the foreign markets. They like the travel. They think, oh my gosh, the world wants more American beer, but they haven't really put any work into it. So it's not that a company needs to come ready saying, I've got this market, this is where I want to go, or I have this particular opportunity in hand. But we want somebody to have some sense of the direction that they want to grow. It can be anecdotal. I met this importer at a festival. I've gotten these inquiries from partners. I have a cousin who runs a distribution business, back home. That's fine. Whatever it is, just having some sense of what makes a good market for you, in the same way that you want to say, oh, I want to sell outside of my home state. Where? Anywhere. That's not great. There are ways to get to know more markets and whittle down the universe a little bit. And we're going to talk about market selection in our second session. But some really light lift ways to do this would be participating in international competitions and trade missions, trade shows, including those that Steve shared that the BA puts together. They can be a really great, first step in pursuing that market identification. Again, we're not saying you need to have all of the answers straight from the jump, but we also don't want it to say everything, the world is my oyster. Well, this is business. There's got to be a strong business case to going after a specific market. We want to make sure that the folks who are looking to a specific place, and because they're approaching it from that business mindset. Finally, and this is something that Steve Parr will talk about in greater detail later on. Companies really need to have a really strong QA, QC regime. Right, this product is going to take longer to make it to the customer's hands, and you really have to make sure that you only get one first impression thing. Really have to make sure that you're going to have an opportunity to show your product well. There's the path to the consumer in that foreign market is often longer and sometimes more opaque than in US settings. And I think a lot of people will know, even in the US, it's not always clear, if you're distributing into multiple territories, where every ounce of beer is going. That's even more so in those foreign markets. Something that's really, you might take for granted in some places in the US. They may not have a really strong cold chain. That product needs to still be able to reach the consumer in good shape, since you're asking people to trade up to your products. The US products are likely going to be on the higher end of the spectrum. This is a craft product, plus it's going to be an import. So you have to make sure that your product is really dialed in from dissolved oxygen, everything like that, really strong packaging, program. Even just having a good solution in place when it comes to draft product. If that's using one-way kegs, then great, but making sure that your team is really dialing in the QA, QC on that. So hopefully these are just our guidelines that we have in place. Again, I know I covered a lot of ground in that. These are general rules of thumb, but hopefully you see yourself in that picture of an export brewery that I just sketched, right? Or at least for most of these points, if you're considering export sales. this is all, kind of theoretical at this point, of course, but hopefully you kind of see what it takes to be export ready. This is specific to beer. But I wanted to take this and ground it, and we wanted to bring in somebody so you could get an example of what this looks like in practice. So I'm going to invite our guest for this session to join us to give his experience of working in this arena here. So hopefully, Steve, if you're able to join us here, thank you. So it is my honor to welcome our guest for today, who is Steve Grossman, brand ambassador at Sierra Nevada Brewing Company. If you're a brewer or a beer drinker in America or overseas for that matter, chances are you know Sierra Nevada. So we are very grateful to have him join us today. Welcome, Steve. Whoops, let me get you. Let's see. There we go.
Am I on?
Yes, indeed. Hey,
Okay,
Steve, thanks for
very good.
joining us.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris.
Absolutely. Well, can you share just a little bit of background on Sierra Nevada's export journey to date?
Sure. We've been exporting for about 17 years now, and I must say we went into the export arena very, very reluctantly. We were concerned about quality of our beer traveling, and at that time, 17, actually, we started looking into this about 19 years ago. There was no cold chain available, and we really didn't want to export. It wasn't on our radar. We did have a gentleman, though, from the UK that was an importer and distributor pursue us for probably 2 years. He would visit the brewery every 6 months, talk to us and say, hey, guys, you really need to export. Your beers here in the gray market, the quality is not looked after. I can do that for you. I can assure the quality. And he said, even though it's not readily available in the UK, we can put together a cold chain for you. So very reluctantly, after 2 years of being pursued, we decided, okay, let's go into the export business. And we started in the UK. We didn't know what we were doing. We'd never exported. And as I said, we hadn't really thought about it. But I was tasked with the job to figure out how to go about exporting. And no one at the brewery knew anything. We didn't know about really shipping overseas, but we knew we needed to get a good broker to look after our product and make sure that the shipping was done correctly and that the containers were at the proper temperature. So we did that. We actually put probes in our, make sure that we were aware of the temperature that our beer is being shipped at. And I went over to the UK to learn all about the business. And luckily, the gentleman who started importing us was extremely knowledgeable. He'd been in beer for 30 years prior, small breweries in the UK, and was a big fan of craft and a big fan of Sierra Nevada. So I picked his brain and did this and learned about the export business. It took a while, and the brewery learned as well. Our logistics people learned how to go about sending our beer over and what we had to do customs wise. And it was certainly a learning process. And now, 17 years later, we're in about 26 countries.
Wow.
Export still being a very small percentage of our overall business. I think it's about 2.5% now. So we started in the UK, and then this gentleman asked us, hey, I've got distributors that I know in other countries. Can we start selling your beer in other countries? I think the second country we went into was Sweden. And so then I went over to Sweden and learned about the business there. Then we went to Ireland and I learned about the business there. And then we went to various other countries and we learned as we went. So it's been a learning process, and I must say it still is a learning process. We're learning all the time how to navigate the export side of the beer business.
Yeah. Oh, that's very interesting. Even though, you started in a very different context 17 years ago. I mean, the beer world has changed 5-6 times since then.
It's changed dramatically, and it changes daily now.
Yeah. And even though, Sierra Nevada, not, every brewery that's tuning in today is going to be in the same position as Sierra Nevada. It's interesting to hear that you have a lot of the similar stories that we've heard from other companies that have successfully gone overseas, which is, you had an inquiry come in, you kind of put it off for a while, said you weren't actively pursuing to start, but you had some level of interest. And that, even you kind of learned as you went, right? The relying on partners, making sure you have really strong, freight forwarder relationships, and that you're working on investing in your team to get them better and better at this, so that as you line up more markets, you're able to grow into it.
That's true. And I'd like to point out, having having a partner that is your importer, having the right partner is extremely important. We've had so many inquiries, and I do due diligence on pretty much all of them if we're looking to enter into a new market. And sometimes it takes 2 years again. I mean, we went into another market, another importer was after us for 2 years. And I did due diligence and finally went with that importer, and we look at all options that are available at the time when we're thinking about entering a market. And I would like to stress that importer and importer relationships is extremely important in regards to how successful you might be. And also important, I had mentioned early on that quality is our biggest concern, and it probably should be everyone who is thinking about exporting. It should be your biggest concern. You want your beer to taste as good wherever any consumer tries it as it is at home. So having an importer that you trust and has similar values as you do at the brewery in terms of looking after quality is super important. And it's also important, I know this is challenging, it's challenging for us also to have feet on the ground, just to check the market once you're there, to see how you're doing. For one, look at your warehousing, make sure that the refrigeration is where the importer says it is. Also, check the market, look at the retailers, how are they treating your beer? So I know it's very challenging, and I still go to, now 17 years, I still go to pretty much every market and visit. In our major markets like the UK, Ireland, I try to go twice a year just to make sure the market's looking right and to maintain that relationship with the importer. We have since now hired a manager for Europe and the UK, so I don't have to go over quite as often. Well, I still go over twice a year, but having someone available just to check the market on a regular basis, or the various markets, is really important, because you're sort of flying blind. You're relying on your importer. Chances are they're doing a great job, but it's also just to have eyes on the ground is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. The importance of that relationship, just similar to, domestic distributors, but maybe even more so since you have less insights into what's happening there. We will be having an importer join us for our second session too, to talk about their perspective in what they look for makes a good client, how they position themselves to be attractive. Since, your fate is in their hands for sure. And, I know obviously there's the matching of resources, making sure that you're putting enough resources in place to be successful in that foreign market. Obviously, as a market grows, investing more and more in that market, whether it's a person or a fractional person there. I should point out, and I'm sure Dan will mention this later on, about some of the resources that are available for companies. So, for instance, the STEP grants that the SBA gives to each state to support companies that are investing in foreign markets, so that might offset certain costs, such as visiting a foreign market. It's on a state-by-state level, but when you work with entities like the SPDCs, we make sure that you're fully plugged in, since all of these things result in costs. So making sure that you're matching the investment of your, in your company to be successful in that market.
Mhm.
So,
I'd also like to point out, it's important to have a contract where you can state your quality initiatives, refrigeration, make sure in your contract that the importer will use cold chain in their shipping from brewery to their warehouse, and certainly cold chain in the warehouse. So that way you'll have some enforceability, just to make sure that you're maintaining your quality. And a couple of things that I was thinking about, what would we do differently? I think a couple of things. What I was thinking about is I probably wouldn't take 2 years now to vet an importer, because you're losing exposure time. And I think it's really important. UK, we were fortunate that we were one of the first American craft breweries to enter the market, and it gave us a big leg up. And I think when entering a new market, the longer you wait, there's opportunity for other breweries to get in and establish themselves, and it takes a while to do that. So if we were to do it again, I think we wouldn't take so long to enter a market. We just had an inquiry about 3 months ago in a new market, and we've entered it now already. So we did vetting much more rapidly, and started doing sales. So I think that's how that helps. Another thing I'd like to point out is you might come across a poor performing importer, and I think once you've tried to correct some of the issues that they are encountering and they aren't able to rectify them in a timely manner, I think you should look for alternative importers. I've maybe waited too long in a couple instances to switch, and you lose valuable sales, and reputation gets tarnished. So I think that's something to look out for as well. And another thing I've noticed that we've maybe could have done a little better in some of our contracts, give us an out earlier, and that's what we're doing now. So the newer contracts we're writing, if there's a distributor that's underperforming and we want to make a switch, make sure your contract allows you to do that in a timely fashion and without paying too much or paying anything to break that contract. I think that's really important as well.
Yeah, I know it's that is the nature of importers. They are there to sell that relationship, and you have to, then it's your job to hold them to it over time. So
correct.
So thinking back to when you were starting out, right, you were maybe somewhat reluctant to that initial interest. You weren't, actively pursuing markets that kind of came to you. How did you know that you were ready to get serious and start investing resources in exports?
Our hand was sort of forced, I think. As I said, we noticed the gray market was not doing us justice in terms of quality. And when I did look into the markets, when I did travel, I'd see our beer in storefronts, unrefrigerated, 2 years old. And that's when we decided we were ready. We want to make sure we protect our reputation, protect the quality of our products. And that forced our hand, and we said, we need to do this. We need to jump in now, even though we were still reluctant. We knew that the beer that we were shipping was going to be fresh as opposed to what was in the market. As I said, a reluctancy, we didn't like shipping our beer for 4 or 5 weeks across the waters, but we knew we had to do that just to stem the tide of the gray market.
Oh, that's very, very interesting. Yeah. I'd be curious to know how many of our people tuning in today, right? They've seen their product on a shelf that it probably shouldn't have been on, right? that happens a lot in beer, both in the US and elsewhere. Beer gets into markets that it's not intentionally being sent to. And I think you're right about the reputational risk. If you ever wanted to intentionally sell product there, you're not showing well if it's
No,
2
you're not
years old.
showing. And as you mentioned earlier in your opening talk, that you really have only one opportunity to reach a consumer. And if that's a poor experience for them, they're going to go elsewhere. So very, very important to make sure your beer is showing well.
So as you were building out your export program in earnest, looking to enter more markets, were there any areas that you felt like you really need to improve upon, or areas that you feel like you kind of made the most gains as a result of getting serious about export sales? And I know you mentioned that you trained your team on the logistics end. Any other areas that you feel like you skilled up on?
No, I just think, as I mentioned earlier, developing the relationship with the importer is primary. It's the most important aspect of this, I think. Just like in the United States, they have many beers, many products to sell. That relationship is key, whether it's here, whether it's in a foreign country, the relationship with your importer. So that's what we've been working on. And also changing gears a little bit, learning about the requirements, the labeling requirements is another thing that we've been doing research on. We have now employed international lawyers at times to make sure that we're in compliance with the labeling laws. Generally, we will ask our importer to sticker the product if it's a brand or a package that's not selling tremendously well. It's on a slower scale. And our key beers, though, we will do special packaging dedicated to that market. That gets to be very expensive, and certainly time consuming for our people in-house, for one, with the artwork, and then our supply chain people. So our supply chain has learned how to deal with the markets as well, somewhat reluctantly because it takes a lot of time. But there's a lot of aspects to exporting that we weren't initially aware of, and some packaging requirements certainly are time consuming for our various teams, but we're learning to deal with that and trying to be more efficient as well. In that regard.
The getting that product saleable for a foreign market, we'll talk about this a little bit on the last session, or the second session, about what it takes to make that product saleable. That's knowing the questions to ask your importer, what they're capable of doing, what's on the table from them, to make that product work in that foreign market. And then if you know that you need to handle some of that adaptation yourself, where to turn. The TTB has some resources. You can rely on people like myself, the U.S. Commercial Service, Steve and his team, about just knowing that there are resources out there now, and there's more and more all the time. But determining what's the right fit for your company, right? Is it if it's one flagship into a key market and you're really focusing there, that's going to suggest one strategy over another. So some of it is knowing where to turn and what your goals are, so that you're not just pursuing a lead that isn't right for your company, right? If it's going to require a massive investment in all new package, designs for 10 brands, maybe it's not right for you.
That's not very efficient.
Yes. Well, Steve, I really appreciate your time here. Do you have any parting words that you'd like to share with our audience of people who might be interested in exporting beer?
Yeah, sure. Export is an exciting part of the business, and I think can be lucrative, and it's a way to help increase sales. But I also want to point out that just like the United States, the market is challenging. There are a lot of local breweries now. So since we've been doing this the 17 years, the local aspect, the local breweries have certainly become much more prominent, and makes it a bit more challenging to, sell product. But there's still a market for American craft. Let's face it, this is where craft started, and most of the markets look to us still for inspiration. And a lot of the consumers, certainly their first experience with craft beer was with American craft. So I think there's still a great opportunity out there for American craft to explore new markets.
Yeah, there's always more places
Explore
to go.
export. Mhm.
Yeah, really appreciate the insight, Steve. You've been at the forefront of this for a while now, and it's really valuable to hear
Well,
your experience and insight. So thank you for your time.
well, thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it.
And now I'd like to welcome back my co-hosts, Dan and Steve. We're going to talk about some key trade issues that breweries need to be aware of when they're considering export sales. We're not by any means going to be exhaustive, and we're really not focusing on issues that every exporter needs to work on. We're trying to just identify some of the things that breweries in particular need to focus on when they're considering export sales. So Dan, Steve, take it away.
Thanks, Chris. So, I think whenever any business is entering a new space, there's a lot of thought about what are the risks. So, and Steve, I know you have some more industry specific. I'm going to take more general financing, speaking at it more from the lender perspective, which, I was for close to 16 years before I came to the SBA, and worked with a lot of breweries who were growing. And it was actually one of the thoughts that was going into this panel, into this series, was there's a number of breweries who grew, or undertook expansions in the late 2010s, and there might be some additional capacity now. And I'm going to look at the risks, speak to the risks a little bit, but also the opportunity from the financing perspective. Generally speaking, the biggest risk that a lender has, or the finance side, is really the performance risk of the brewery. That your core business is producing and selling beer, and that's locally, maybe even regionally if you're in several states. And then there's becomes a question of, well, can the brewery do this successfully overseas, or can it go into Canada and Mexico, and depending on your markets. And Steve, you had that great graphic up showing all the different markets in the world, and each one of those markets, like each different state in the United States, has different rules. So the performance risk of the brewery, and I think that's really where the SBDC network, or associations like BA, are so important to help a brewery who, in addition to producing projects and being the head of HR and supply chain and all the other challenges they have in their day-to-day life, now we're expecting them to add international beer retailing and wholesaling onto that, and that can be challenging. So I think that's where the SBDC is really well positioned across the country. And the ASBDC, America's SBDC network, being kind of the national association, can help route you in your specific market to somebody who can help. Myself, here in the Office of International Trade, we have export finance managers around the country. They're in most major metropolitan areas, and they are another avenue or starting point. When it comes to help, our mission is really helping small businesses expand internationally, and I don't think there's a wrong starting point, even if it ultimately is not the SBA, but we work very closely with the SBDC network there. When it comes to the two general risks involved in international trade, we'll say this: fortunately, craft beer exporters are a little insulated from both. So typically, it is currency risk, and then generally non-payment. Now, currency is mitigated primarily through selling in US dollars. So you're not taking foreign currency, whether it's the euro, pound, or any other currency. So if you're selling in US dollars, you're not taking that fluctuation. If you do ultimately decide to invoice in a different currency, you might be taking some additional risk. The biggest issue that most businesses exporting run into is what do you do in the event of non-payment? You have limited recourse, and I think that's where there is a product called trade credit insurance It's required by most lenders when extending working capital against foreign accounts receivable. But essentially what it's doing is, as Steve pointed out, Steve Grossman pointed out about the importer, if you are dealing with non-payment, the insurance would actually come in to cover you typically somewhere in the range of 90 cents on the dollar. So that can be an important tool that goes into the vetting of an importer. So if you are selling on terms, that might be something to look at. But Steve, I know you mentioned a wide range of risks as it relates specifically to the beer side, but would you be able to share some of those?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So there's, certainly the big picture things that you can't control, but may want to consider when evaluating a market. There's political risks, things like Brexit, the trade war with China resulting in retaliatory tariffs, the war in Ukraine. We were investing previously in market development in both Russia and Ukraine prior to 2020. These are all things where we have specific examples where U.S. brewers were impacted in those markets. There's you mentioned some of the economic risks like inflation and currency fluctuation that may slow down buying from importers, and then the regulatory frameworks. But to focus on a few that I think are more nuanced towards exporting U.S. brewers, there's things like growing local craft markets that are a bit of a double-edged sword. On one hand, the local craft beer community provides evidence of a potential market for your beer. They play a strong role in developing a market for imported crafts by growing consumer awareness, growing the number of on and off-premise establishments that specialize or feature crafts. But as was in the U.S., it can take decades for shelf space and consumer demand to catch up with that supply. And so these are often competing products that are available at a lower price. Another one is sustainability, and something that I think we should have back of minds. The EU in particular is really active in considering new regulatory policy to encourage imports from sustainable suppliers and just generally to minimize the climate cost of imported products. And so an example would be in Sweden, we're seeing tenders for wine that specifically stated as sustainable wines. Packaging is a big area of focus here, and I suspect we're going to see a push more towards things like this and buy local campaigns because of the sustainability efforts that we're seeing come out of markets that consumers are looking for. There's trademark challenges. China is an example where we've had some of our members deal with some trademark issues, folks using their logos. We have resources to help breweries navigate that, but it's something that you have to consider and try to be proactive for. You mentioned the payment issues and transactional risk. Especially in the last few years as the buyer community is still recovering. Importers not providing payments within an agreed upon schedule is something that we've heard about increasingly in the last few years. But there are insurance programs that you can take advantage of that Dan mentioned. What else? Regulatory challenges and changes, things like new labeling requirements. Mexico imposed a new labeling requirement in the last 2 years. And we've had to adapt to that for our own events, but also working with our importers to create solutions for U.S. brewers getting their beer into the markets. For many, if not all these, there are solutions, preventative measures, and resources available, that we've all mentioned here to help exporters curb that risk. But it's an important part of building an export business plan and defining how you're going to mitigate that risk to make way for success.
Yeah, absolutely. There are, I want to emphasize that point that there are lots of resources at your fingertips, particularly in this space. You may have built your business with very little outside support. Be aware that there is a significant amount of support, federal, state level, the Brewers Association, your trade groups, your perhaps your state guild, lots of support out there for companies that are looking. Do not be shy. The good part is once you have taken advantage of one resource, everyone's very good about helping you identify the other resources that are available. So if you come to the SBDC, as a brewery interested in exporting, we're going to make sure that you're aware of the SBA, the BA, the other partners that are out there, the U.S. Commercial Service. There are lots of entities out there. So we don't mean to scare you. We just want to make sure you're putting the right amount of working on the front end so that you build an export program that's going to be functional, that you're de-risking it as much as possible for yourself. Steve, go ahead.
I was, just to build on that, Chris,
Yeah.
back to and we're going to cover the financing, at length in the third session of the series, but I actually think it makes for a stronger brewery. It's market diversification, and it's a challenging industry. Every business owner, every brewery is no stranger to challenge. So it's not to say that you can't export, or export's just going to be too much. It really does come down to a plan, a partnership, but the ability to be proactive, to think of how to open up new markets and how that can play into, a growth strategy or for the brand, and especially for products that might be a little more shelf stable. Think barrel-aged products. That was one of the things we were talking about. There's such a, it's a golden age if you want to have barrel-aged beers now. There's so much out there, but that also means that there could be a saturation where that can give you some opportunities down the line to open up new markets. So, from a lending perspective, it's not, it's not that the brewery is going to be so overexposed to foreign markets. If anything, it just complements, their core domestic business. And then it really can become more of an opportunistic play. If you have additional capacity, if there's a good buying opportunity, if you have an importer who has a need or is putting together an order for, one country or another, that really can play, into your hand in the long term, but it requires you to be, proactive. And I think that's where the business plan comes in. Chris, you touched on the state trade expansion or STEP grant program. And that's a grant program that's administered by the Small Business Administration through our state partners that can really help offset some of the front end costs, whether it's website translation, visiting shows, to actually going overseas and meeting with importers directly. So there are some real benefits that come out of it. And I think being proactive is probably the easiest way to mitigate those.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'll say absolutely the resources to help allay some of these burdens here, right? None of these are insurmountable. Just identifying them is a large part. So again, there are these very hard issues, right? Tariffs, right? Beer isn't typically caught up in the tariff space, although our distilling friends certainly got caught in the middle a little bit during some trade tensions just a few years ago. And that's really difficult to be successful under those sort of conditions. But even some of the softer things, like they're called non-tariff barriers, just other things that make it harder for you as an imported product to succeed in a foreign market against other products. So within the beer world, Steve Grossman mentioned the label adaptation. That's just a new burden that you have to address. Again, either your in-country partner can sticker your product for you, or you can take advantage of some resources to develop your own, country-specific label. That can take all, these non-tariff barriers can take all kinds of forms. So sometimes a market will require phytosanitary testing where you have to send samples over. Okay, good to know. Important to be aware of that. Some highly controlled markets, there are markets that have very strong government hand in the purchasing and retailing of beer. Your Canada and Scandinavia, they may have things like that seem pretty esoteric, and as long as you identify them, it's not insurmountable. It's just you don't want to miss that step. So for instance, in Ontario, the province is the one that purchases the beer, and they require, in addition to phytosanitary testing, you have to send up your case box for stress testing, because they have a very highly automated warehouse, and they want to make sure that your boxes won't crumble. That's just an extra step, right? And if you know that it's coming and you were prepared for it, and you work with all of these different trade support groups, you're going to be able to identify it, build it into your timeline, and still hit the shelf on time, with a profit margin intact. If you don't have them identified, again, you don't have to do it yourself. That's where you run into trouble. So just a word to want to make sure everyone knows: lean on your trade support partners. That's what one of the major takeaways of this whole program is lots of resources. You don't have to know all these things yourself immediately from the get-go. There are people out here to help.
Yeah, I'll just add that, as you just said, your importer on these trade compliance pieces is oftentimes going to be your first, second, third line of defense. They have labeling templates where you can just fill in the required information. So it's easier for printing. In some cases, they'll do the labeling for you. That Mexico example that I just previously mentioned, there's services now where the beer just arrives at the border and the importer works with a local contractor to produce and affix the labeling. So it's not even something that you always have to do at the brewery. But for any of these trade compliance pieces, I can share links that the TTB has a directory online where it's a drop-down menu. You select the country and it's got a list of the labeling requirements, the documentation that you need. We have examples of templates that you can fill in. It's all information that you know and have at the brewery. And we have webinar recordings that are all just about building an export compliance book. So, once you have some of the certificates that are required for export completed, you keep them on hand or in a file on your computer and you just update them with every shipment. And you get really good at these processes after the first few times you're getting shipments on the road. So we can provide those webinars. The TTB has online resources. I know SBA does as well. So those trade compliance pieces exist, but there's a ton of help for you.
Absolutely. And when we speak to our importer in our next session, we'll be asking a little bit about the types of assistance that he provides to his supplying companies. Again, I think a lot of the importers that are working with American craft breweries are aware that there are not entire export divisions that they are working with. With only a handful of exceptions, craft breweries don't have very many divisions, right? We're talking about ideally there's somebody who is responsible for coordinating the team. People have very clear expectations of what their roles are in executing an international order. And then, ideally it becomes second nature over time. But the good news is, and I guess this is good news for exporting, maybe not overall, you are all in a very highly regulated industry that has a lot of idiosyncrasies from one market to another. So compared to other product classes and other industries, you are probably better prepared to succeed in foreign markets for that reason. So yes, do not be discouraged by some of the things we talked about today. We just want to make sure we're introducing these issues, getting on the top of your mind as you start getting more serious about entering foreign markets. So it looks like we are basically right on schedule. So we are coming to the end of our time here today. I'd like to thank my co-hosts, Dan and Steve here, as well as our fantastic guest, Steve Grossman. I know we covered a lot of ground in this first session. In our next session, we're going to be talking about market selection, partner identification, and export strategy. In our third session, Dan's going to be talking about kind of getting the deal done, the financing of, actually getting this order ready to into that foreign market. So if you haven't already registered for our second session, we will be, which is going to be taking place on July 11th at noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific. You're going to receive a link to register as well as a recording of today's session by an email very soon. And we really look forward to having you with us for the rest of these sessions. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and looking forward to seeing you on the 11th.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Chris. We'll see everybody next time.
Okay.
Bye now.